The rain poured in soaking sheets. Lightning flashed and thunder boomed in the black midnight. It was one hell of a storm, but it seemed that the worst was over. The Minerva cruised along, the waves of the Pacific Ocean bumping against her bow. The scent of sea salt soothed Richard Wood as he inhaled, standing on the forecastle deck. He scratched his clean-shaven face, his old Greek fisherman's hat dripping with water. The yellow poncho he wore over his clothes was slick with rainwater and shined in the light of the ship. A bolt of lightning flashed, lighting up the Minerva for a brief second. He loved being out on the water, rain or shine. Not even the storm dampened his spirits. For the last 4 years, he had been the captain of the fishing trawler. He learned everything from his father and his father before him. He came from a family who made a living out in the sea. He held all the crew members of the ship close to him. They were a loyal bunch and knew how to do their jobs. All of which were looking forward to heading back to the mainland. After over a month out at sea, they were all eagerly waiting to finally be home, to be back with their families, to eat special cooked meals, to crash into comfortable beds, to be home. Some of them were going to take some time to enjoy their summer. One of Richard's crew members even said he would take his wife and son to Orlando for a week and check out the sights. Richard heard tapping behind him, the sound of boots on steel. Someone was walking toward him. "Richard!" A man's voice called out above the sound of the wind. Richard turned his head back, seeing Hollis, the Minerva's first mate, standing a couple of yards from him. Another lightning strike. The look on Hollis's face was a mixture of alarm and concern. "Come with me below deck. There's something you need to see." Richard turned around, facing Hollis. "What's going on?" "We found a man," Hollis replied. "He's unconscious and seriously injured. It doesn't look good." Richard followed Hollis down the stairs off the deck, past the conveyor belt, and through the narrow wooden hallways where the living quarters were. As they walked, Richard could hear the sound of the rain in the waves from outside. The expression on Hollis's face remained unchanged, full of fear. He looked very pale to Richard in the light coming from the bulbs on the ceilings above. Almost all the color drained from his face. As they walked, Hollis spoke. "James found him drifting on a handmade raft port side," he said. "He was knocked out cold. He got Lawrence and Ben to bring up to the ship. James brought him here to examine him, and he sent me to find you." "When was he found?" Richard asked, keeping up with Hollis as he shuffled quickly through the halls. "Less than 5 minutes ago." They both came to a stop in front of one of the cabins. The room's door was shut. Hollis wrapped his fingers around the doorknob and looked at Richard. "I have to say this. Be prepared for a shock." Hollis twisted the knob and pushed the door open. As the door opened, Richard could hear some ragged breathing. He looked into the cabin. Like all the other ones, it wasn't very large. On the other side of the room, a single window showed the storm outside, the curtains spread apart. On the left side, a mahogany dresser stood by the wall. A round mirror hung above it. On the right side, James stood beside the bed, the plain white sheets laying on the pale hardwood floor in bunches by his feet. A torn and bloody shirt was tossed aside. James had a frown on his face. His dark eyes narrowed, a cigarette smoking in his mouth. Lying in the bed was a man lying on his belly. Richard could see the blood on his bare back and shoulders. The sight of it made him shudder. James turned to face Richard, his frown still plastered on his face. "He doesn't look too good, Richard," he said in a thick British accent, taking the cigarette out. "Chances are he might not survive." Richard slowly moved towards the bed where the man laid. He heard Hollis come inside with him. shutting the door behind him. The closer Richard got, the more the damage he could see, which seemed to look even worse as he approached. The incapacitated man's breath was shallow. Richard could also smell a very pungent odor. He had never smelled anything like it. It wasn't like the stench of freshly caught fish. This smell was much stronger. It reeked of flesh, like a carcass. Jesus, he thought, that smell is nasty. Richard stood beside James. It was then he saw the wounds. The poor man had 3 long lacerations on his back. They first started below the back of his right shoulder and came to a ragged tear near his left rib cage. The wound poured blood all over his back and onto the bed, soaking it in a pool of dark red. The wounds were edged in ugly black scabs. Richard could see a bit of the man's spine peeking from the middle slash mark. Richard could also see another wound on his left shoulder, numerous puncture marks that seemed to form a narrow semi-oblong shape. These wounds were also outlined in black, surrounded in pale red skin. The man was attacked by some sort of animal, James said. He was mauled in the back and shoulders. How can you tell? Hollis asked. James stuck the cigarette back between his lips. I've seen it happen before. When I was a young lad, my father and I were hiking up a mountain, and we watched a man as he was attacked by a wild bear. The bloody bastard barely survived. These wounds, he pointed to the injuries on the man's back with his thumb, are just like the wounds we found on the hiker. I also found this embedded in his shoulder, James said. This confirms it was an animal that attacked him. Richard looked at James as he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He lifted his hand up to chest level and opened it. Laying in his palm was a pale, small object. It was sharp, serrated. It was a tooth. What the hell? Richard said, taking the tooth from James. He inspected it, moving it around in his hand. The tooth was about 2 inches long. The curved edges were serrated like a shark's, yellow and caked with flecks of blood. That is proof that this man was attacked by some type of creature, James said. I am certain of it. Richard looked up from his hand and looked at James, moving the tooth on his fingertips, then gazed at the stranger. You think this guy might stand a chance? We'll have to see, James replied. I'll give him some antibiotics and gauze his wounds. Otherwise, this is anyone's guess. Richard nodded affirmatively. Very well. I'm going back out, Hollis said. Make sure everything is in working order. As Hollis walked out, James turned to follow him. Before he could walk out the door, James spoke again. Richard. Richard stopped in place and let out a silent sigh. He turned around and faced James again. I don't wish to raise alarm, James said, but there is something bothering me about these injuries. Like what? Richard asked. Aside from the fact that they're huge? These wounds weren't made by any sea creature. James walked over to him. To Richard, the air chilled, and he felt an ominous feeling spread through him as the man approached him. It wasn't a barracuda or even a shark. The lacerations on his back are claw marks. They were made by some sort of animal. James looked back at the man on the bed. It slashed him in the back and bit his shoulder. Somehow he managed to escape and drift out to the ocean. Richard felt disbelief rush in his mind. James, we're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The nearest landmass isn't for hundreds of miles. Precisely the reason for my concern. How is it he was attacked by a land animal when there is no land for a long way off? Unless, of course, there is land somewhere close. Richard felt a chuckle escape his throat. You think there could possibly be land nearby? I have every reason to believe that there might be a new land, James replied, his face deadpan. Unless this man was attempting a very dramatic and violent suicide, which I doubt, then there has to be a place no man has ever seen before. Richard shook his head in disbelief. I'm going to radio the docks. Let them know we found a man drifting out at sea. They'll probably take him to the emergency room once we arrive. If he wakes up before we get there, we can interrogate him. Then Richard left the room, not giving the thought of a new land any consideration. The next day, clouds remained in the sky, but there was no rain. Richard made his way back to the room where the wounded man was placed. If he's awake, Richard would make him explain the reason behind his encounter. He came to a stop in front of the door and knocked loudly. "Hey," he said loudly. "Hey, are you up?" No answer. Richard knocked once again. "Hey, are you awake? Hello?" Still no response. Richard grabbed the doorknob and opened the door. And the first thing he saw was the man hanging on a rope, a noose around his neck. "Jesus H. Christ!" Richard shouted, flinching backwards. He gripped his chest tightly, his heart slamming out of his chest. His breath quickened. "Richard?" he heard James call out. "Are you okay?" James came up to him. He must have looked right at the hanging man, because Richard heard him cry, "What the fuck? The bleeding bastard killed himself!" An uneasy silence took over the space. Richard didn't know how long it lasted. Seconds? Minutes? Hours? He had no idea. The whole time he just stared at the man. His head was lolled to the side, his eyes wide, and his tongue sticking out. It was James who broke the silence. "I'll go radio the mainland. This'll kill him." And then he left. Richard, however, remained. Why would the man go off the deep end and kill himself? What would have driven him so mad he would put an end to his life? Richard then saw the man had something crumpled in one of his hands. He came closer to the body and clutched the hand. It was limp and cold to the touch, kind of clammy. He pried the fingers loose and took out the object. It was a bunched up piece of paper. Richard straightened it out. As he did, he could make out a message. The letters were written quickly and shakily, as if the writer was terrified and in a hurry. He could see a few dark red drops of dry blood on some of the parts of the paper. When he managed to open it up completely, he read what it said. "Beware the island. The island exists. They lied to us."